1960 associate professor of business administration at Harvard Business School, a faculty affiliate of the Harvard Department of Economics, and has a bunch of other affiliations that I could spend a few hours going through. He is, speaking of frontier, he's also been working on, he was an early pioneer in market design. He's been working as at the interface of market design and technology. And most recently, he joined as a A16Z crypto research partner and has been working on the economics of various things related to blockchains and cryptocurrencies, including NFT communities. So today he's going to tell us about some of his more traditional mechanism design work on redistribution and marketplace design. With that long introduction, Scott, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. I don't know if I can follow that introduction, but I'll do my best. This is joint work with Mohammad Akbarpour and Piotr Dworczak. And although, as you'll see on the slides, we've used certified random order for the author names, let me tell you that in some Shapley value sense, you should apportion more than 2/3 of the credit to my co-authors, because the research program I'm going to describe certainly could have happened without me, but could never have happened without either of them. And so in some Shapley value sense, if you look at the marginal contributions over all the sub-coalitions, like more than 2/3 of the Shapley value, sort of would end up on them. So please, I'm the one giving the talk, but let me really emphasize the degree of credit and credit to my extraordinary and brilliant co-authors, Mohammad and Piotr. Let me also just very quickly say what an honor it is to be speaking in this series in support of Ukraine and specifically the Kyiv School in the midst of a surreal and terrible, sort of time in history for the country. Like the importance of academic and scholarly friendship and engagement, is more important than ever before. And so I'm very, very honored to be a part of this series. So, background framing question. And this is, I'm going to, I'll present, mostly around a specific paper called Redistributive Allocation Mechanisms, but I'm going to, sort of first really present the agenda. I'm thinking of this like also sort of as an agenda style, like public talk explaining like how Mohammad and Piotr and our web of growing web of collaborators have been thinking about these questions. The high level question is, how should we design marketplaces in the presence of inequality? And the key framing assumption, and we'll maintain this throughout, is that the designer is the regulator or literally creator. I'll talk a lot about marketplaces of a single marketplace. You sort of only have control over one market. And so in particular, you don't have access to macroeconomic tools like taxation. You're not going to be able to do sort of like large scale redistributive taxation. But in fact, it's very common for, local regulators or regulators of like individual verticals to try and address inequality in their markets. And we know just, anecdotally, sort of like casual empirically, price controls, subsidies, and in-kind, distribution are abundant in these contexts, right? We see public housing and rent control. These are price controls or sort of in-kind allocation. We see, sort of subsidized or free healthcare. Similarly, food, in the context of food stamps or other in-kind food redistribution programs. Road access is an interesting case because it's sort of the dog in the nighttime not barking, right? The average economist thinks that congestion pricing is a great idea for all the natural reasons, and yet you see over and over again opposition to congestion pricing, both by policymakers and by populations, on the basis that you don't want to sort of price the roads, right? You don't want to roads should be a good that are accessible to all. And to an economist, it's a little bit of a strange statement, right? Like, yes, yes, roads should be accessible to all, but if you can reduce congestion, you can actually increase throughput and create a Pareto improvement whereby everyone gets where they're going, faster. And yet somehow this idea still that your ability to pay should not drive your access to the roads, sticks. And then the last one, and we've all thought about this a lot over the last year and a half, is vaccines. that's a context where willingness to pay would have, varied wildly. But we tend to think that willingness to pay is not particularly clearly correlated with degree of need or like the social importance of vaccinating different types of individuals. And so I don't know if we'll have time to get to it today, but we have a worked example sort of the framework in this paper in a follow-up joint paper with Eric Budish, where we work through what, sort of thinking about these redistributive allocation mechanisms is going to imply for vaccine prioritization. But first, let me just, as I said, like, let's step back and think at a high level for a moment. Like, are these policies a good idea? And of course, the knee-jerk economics answer is no, right? We're opposed to price controls, right? They distort market efficiency. And so there's like a standard view that like all of these policies that we're seeing are inefficient, right? Better to maximize the value of the market and redistribute. But of course, there are some frictions to, sort of global, like, sort of redistribution. And meanwhile, to the extent that you are a marketplace designer and you care about inequality, I'm going to argue you might actually want something that looks a little bit like a price control. And here's the incredibly simple intuition for this. So this is like, Econ 101 supply and demand curves. Bear with me because I can never remember how to read these things. This is true. I'm really bad at graphs. So supply curve slopes up, demand curve slopes down. You can think of each one of these people on the supply curve, or dots in the supply curve, as like a person, whose cost of providing the good is that point on the curve. And similarly on the demand curve, these are like people's values for acquiring the good from a supplier. And why do we choose, the market clearing price, this like point where supply and demand cross? Well, it eliminates two different sources of inefficiency, right? If, for example, if we push the price above market clearing, we first of all, we don't clear as much trade as the market is willing to bear. There's this triangle. It's like the dead weight loss triangle. These are trades that the market would be very happy to make, right? So there are some people who are willing to buy prices above which other people are willing to sell, but we don't execute the trades because we fixed the price too high. And then the second inefficiency, it's not as visually clear, but it's this dashed line right here. So because more people want to sell than want to buy, right? We have a bunch more sellers than there are buyers. We have to do some sort of rationing. And in the work I'll tell you about today, and sort of generally in the Econ 101 frame as well, we assume like a pretty inefficient form of rationing, like we're just randomly allocating uniformly. And so that means that we don't have the lowest cost sellers selling. We have some sellers sell who aren't really the efficient ones. And so those are two allocative distortions that push towards market clearing pricing, right? If we use the market clearing price, we get back that triangle and there's no distortion in like who sells. There's no need to ration. But okay, so this is the Econ 101 picture. And there's something that's always been in this picture, but I at least never noticed until we started working on these projects, which is this rectangle right here, right? So when I push the price above the market clearing level, not only do I distort the allocation, but I effect a transfer, right? I take some of the surplus that was going to the buyers and I transfer it to the sellers. So we don't have as many sellers as selling as we might otherwise want. We don't necessarily have the right sellers selling from a full economic efficiency perspective, but the sellers who sell make more money than they would otherwise. And if we care about equity in addition to efficiency, that might be really valuable, right? If we're in a market environment where we know that the sellers, for whatever reason, and I'll give some examples in a moment, if we know that the sellers are, in some fashion in greater need than the buyers, then we might value this transfer, right? There might just be like a really high social welfare rate on that rectangle. And that might be high enough, at least potentially, that it overcomes the two allocative distortions we've introduced. So what's a simple example of like where that might actually make sense? My co-authors and I often talk in this context about rideshare, right? Rideshare is an unusual market, right? Like it's personal rapid transit, So the people who are buying are buying a form of transit that is, more expensive and sort of, individually optimized than, lots of other ways of getting around, like walking or taking public transit or something of the sort. And indeed, like, when people do so, they're often doing it on budgets and things, right? And so the average rideshare consumer, not uniform like across the whole system, but the average rideshare consumer is like reasonably high wealth and means. Meanwhile, the the sellers mostly are doing this as like a second or third job, right? This is like a flexible way to obtain additional cash. Or even if you are doing it full time, this is like a very low income job on average. And so simply by like which side of the market you're choosing to participate in, we're actually learning something about your level of need, right? We're learning that if you're a driver in rideshare, you probably have more need on average than the riders do, again, on average. And so that's a context where we might think that these sorts of welfare weights make sense. But then let me take it one step further. So at the start of the pandemic, at least in the United States, rideshare became, like driving rideshare became a much more dangerous proposition all of a sudden, right? There's a new respiratory virus, like nobody quite understands how it's spread or what its incidence or what the associated risks are, but clearly having lots of people getting in and out of your car is a higher risk thing to be doing than not. And looks like a higher risk thing to be doing than it did, days earlier. And yet some people started driving rideshare for the very first time. And like the interpretation there is not that these people are like, inherently risk seeking or like, sort of trying to expose themselves to the coronavirus. Rather, the natural interpretation is that for whatever reason, this was a moment where like they suddenly found themselves in need, right? Maybe they were furloughed from their job, sort of in early stage lockdowns. Maybe they had a family member who got sick and suddenly needed extra money. Whatever the case, your decision to sort of provide this service in this time where the risks went up is even more indicative of need. And indeed, the market can figure that out immediately, right? Because rideshare has free entry. You can just flexibly like pivot into this market before the government, sort of figures out anything in particular that they want to do redistributively, and possibly, revealing information about your type that the government couldn't see, like that you have a sick family member in the immediate short term. And so there's a possibility that, sort of effecting redistribution through a market like rideshare, again, where like price is regulated and managed, and even to the extent that it's not regulated, it's managed by a centralized platform. Effecting redistribution in these contexts might, be a way to, sort of efficiently transfer money to people in need, potentially even eliciting information that the government might not have directly. Let me just do one more version of the thought experiment, and then I'll say a little bit about, then I'll say a little bit more applied stuff, and then and throughout pause for questions or shout out in the chat and so forth. Like, I'm happy to, it's an economics seminar. I'm happy to take questions as we go. But like one more thought experiment, just to like, again, sort of, push on our intuition here from classical economics. Let's just imagine a frictionless buyer-seller market. And let's imagine that the sellers become systematically poorer than the buyers, right? So what happens, so I have a buyer-seller market. I take the sellers and I make them more and more and more needy in the sense that they need cash. So as you do that, what happens to the competitive equilibrium price? Well, the sellers put a higher value on money. Their rate of substitution has changed. And so the market takes advantage of that to clear more trade. Right? If you're more in need, then on the margin, you're willing to accept a lower price, all else equal. But of course, the poorer I make the sellers, the more the social planner wants them to have money, right? So as I make the sellers poorer and poorer relative to buyers, the more the social planner wishes the market would transfer to them, but the less money, the competitive equilibrium pricing transfers to them. These effects are in completely different topological spaces, right? They're not like sort of like on the same chart, but it's clear they're moving in opposite directions. And that implies that past some point, competitive equilibrium pricing is not socially optimal, even for single price mechanisms necessarily, right? Like you know, past some point, you know, the competitive equilibrium price is asymptotically zero. The social planner would like people to have money. And so, you know, even for a single price mechanism, we're going to want something above the competitive equilibrium price. Steve, how do we call on people of the system?
Yeah, I was just unmuted by the magic of whoever
Amazing.
is in the control room. Yes, but you can't see my pretty face, unfortunately. Anyhow, very interesting, Scott. And of course, from the get-go, I'm thinking that, thank you for that. I think, am I back?
Yes, there we go.
Back.
Much improved.
Okay.
Great to see you.
Thank you. Thank you, Colin. You know, I'm thinking about the fact that for most of the time, and especially for me as an economist, whenever I talk about efficiency, I really, or you know, socially optimal outcomes, I really focus on efficiency and not on any distributional issues, because I've always viewed myself as the economist as the bureaucrat, right? Tell me your objective function and I will help you optimize for that objective function.
Totally.
I'm getting the impression that you're saying the same, but in today's climate, when we do hear people at Washington talking about price controls and stuff like that, I don't think that people are often honest about that admission that, yeah, we are willing to screw X to help Y, right? And I think it's just important to keep that front and center. I don't think you're avoiding it. I guess I'd like it to even be more pronounced, if that makes sense.
And in the model, it will be. The model is going to explicitly have a welfare weight term that enters into the objective function for each individual. And you know, a lot of what's going on is going to be that the mechanism is trying to elicit as much as we can about that welfare weight. But the welfare weights, exactly as you say, are going to come from policy, are going to come from, you know, sort of some outside view on what the welfare weights should be. Great question. Any further questions while we're here? Going once. All right, sold. So in a prior paper, you know, and here, like, it's a little bit confusing because we have slightly different parameterizations of this welfare weight term I was just speaking about. In the prior paper, we explicitly modeled inequality as dispersion in the marginal values for money. Here we're gonna, you know, and then everything maps into a rate of substitution and welfare weight term. Here we're going to explicitly model just in the rate of substitution and welfare weights in a few minutes. But just quickly to sort of, you know, close out this high level story. And what we really show there is, you know, that there is sort of a Chicago style case for price controls, right? The optimal mechanism, as soon as you account for these sort of, you know, heterogeneous welfare weights, you know, sort of whether they're marginal values for money, like this richer and poorer scenario I was just describing, or some more complex, you know, sort of welfare objective, the optimal mechanism actually is going to potentially involve, you know, two different types of price control, either, you know, sort of a price control that induces rationing, or a price wedge between the buyer and seller side. And indeed, for the rideshare example I was just describing, the efficient mechanism is basically a what you might think of as a you know, as a you know, internal tax. So like you bump up the price of all of the rides, and then use that to make a lump sum transfer to everybody on the seller side. You know, and even better, I guess, you know, if this is far outside the model, but even better if it could be in some, like, you know, increasing returns to scale form, like buying health insurance for all the drivers or something like that. This is, of course, implying, you know, this is all a sort of like static-ish allocation setting, right? We're doing optimal mechanism design, assuming that the welfare weights are reasonably constant and they're not being changed by our distribution through the mechanism. Although, as hopefully the intuition from the supply-demand chart will show, I don't think any of the dynamics I'm talking about here sort of don't hold up in general equilibrium, right? They're going to be muted, right? If by doing internal redistribution, you raise people's, like, so, you know, sort of socioeconomic status enough to change their welfare weight or something like that, then you might not want to do as much of an internal redistributive transfer, but I think you still are basically going to want to do so. And then footnote, of course, you know, this does really tie into marketplace policy. You know, the rideshare example is a little bit abstracted in the way I've been telling the story. Like, I'm not describing precisely what rideshare companies do, but there have been arguments and experiments around, sort of equivalence of using rideshare for redistribution, some sort of like minimum wage or fixed transfer through the system. And a question I frequently get is like, but in a competitive market with multiple platforms competing, wouldn't you expect, sort of doing some sort of redistributive allocation to actually just like, break everything, right? Like, why would any firm ever opt into doing this? In the context of rideshare, where there's sort of per trend price competition, at first you think, yeah, of course, right? If like, if one rideshare company has been, chooses to bump their price up in such a fashion that the drivers make more money, that has to somehow push through the higher prices to the buyers, which means they're just going to switch to the competing platform. That's at least not totally obvious because there's this labor market shifting in the background as well, right? If one firm is offering higher prices, then maybe people will move. But what really matters actually is something more about like long-term service quality, right? And here, like Airbnb, for example, now has issued a host endowment, which among other things is intended to sort of help ensure hosts, so that they can make long-term investments in providing higher quality service. And if you do that well, it can close, it can sort of close the loop, right? You do something that shifts more value to the suppliers, they build, sort of higher quality supply or engage in higher quality transactions. And that can actually grow value for everybody. At minimum, as a footnote, the Uber wage experiment seems to have worked and the companies actually seem to have made more money. So like New York City, introduced a requirement of a minimum wage for rideshare drivers. And like, it turns out that rideshare riders are super price inelastic, exactly as you would expect. And so the net effect seems to have been the drivers made more money and the platforms, the evidence seems to be they either like broke even or made a little bit of money on the margin. Colin, go for it.
Is this is an efficiency wage again? Is that so you're going to give us a mechanism for implementing an efficiency? This is a mechanism for implementing an efficiency wage, or
interesting. I mean, I guess so. So the efficiency wage response is sort of going to be outside of the model, but like I think of it intuitively as generating such a thing, right? Like the dynamic version, yes. So we're gonna, and I guess you could implement that through the welfare rates, right? So it doesn't just have to be a policymaker setting up, like I want to redistribute to this person because I'm concerned about their welfare because of their socioeconomic status or neighborhood or profession or whatever. You could imagine that actually like the welfare weight comes from a platform optimizing its long run horizon or something like that.
Yeah. The other analogy that came to mind, the story about Ford paying his workers above the minimum wage so they could afford to buy Fords. That's there's a GE effect there, I guess, but that's a different story than the one you're telling.
So they could afford to buy Fords. Yeah, I don't have a good instinct of whether that fits into our framework. I mean, I guess
yep.
I'll have to think about it. It feels similar, but not quite the same. Let's maybe talk about it. So
fine. Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah, let's maybe talk about that in the post hoc discussion. I don't have a good answer immediately.
There is the marketing benefit of we eat our own dog food, right?
Exactly. we use our own platforms or we drive our own cars. Totally. Right. Sorry. And then, sort of one more just as while we're in like, sort of platform applied world, there's this growing view that a lot of creator economy platforms are actually, sort of being hampered in terms of long-term growth by the fact that their views or their user engagement or whatever is so right tail dominated. Right, the tail is very, very thin, and it is super hard to become part of that tail, because the short run incentive is always to show people things that are popular, people are going to like. But in terms of the long run, you have to generate new creators, you have to filter in new content, and more broadly, you have to incentivize people to become creators in the first place, which if you can never break into the top tier is very hard to do. And so that's yet another story where like, some amount of like distributional equity actually might matter to the marketplace designer, even in a for-profit setting. Okay, so on to, sort of the theory paper for the day. So as I mentioned, like we're mostly going to frame around this paper on redistributive allocation mechanisms. It's a little bit different. So the redistribution through markets paper, I just, sort of spoke about it in abstract terms is a two-sided market model with buyers and sellers. Here, we're going to focus on a one-sided allocation model and instead use it to, basically use it to understand like a framework for when you actually want to do redistributive allocation, right? So by focusing on a one-sided market, we're going to get a sharper picture of when these sorts of redistributive tools are useful. So we're going to imagine that a designer is allocating goods of heterogeneous quality to agents differing in observed and unobserved characteristics, and I'll give all of this notation soon. We're going to find the optimal mechanism under incentive and individual rationality constraints. And then exactly as I said to Steve earlier, we're going to implement redistributive concerns via, unobserved welfare weights. And again, those could be, sort of essentially anything the policymaker wants. What's going to matter is how those welfare weights relate to the information we can observe and or elicit. So we'll see that the optimal mechanism's degree of redistributive allocation is going to depend on the interaction between those welfare weights and the observability of agents' characteristics, the extent to which we actually want to raise revenue, like how revenue generated by the mechanism is used, and then a little bit also on what we'll call whether the good is universally desirable. And then again, footnote, I've said this a couple of times already, but just one more reminder, this is a market design perspective in the sense the designer only controls a single market. We're imagining that you're setting policy over distributing this like individual good or sort of not like, over sort of like all sort of possible, allocations and, of all goods in society. But note that the weight on revenue is going to be a little bit like, sort of the, it's like a very, very reduced form for, the government or the marketplace designers like role in broader public good provision or something, right? A really, really high weight on revenue in the context of a private firm designing a marketplace is, presumably just them raising revenue. In a government allocation context, a really high weight on revenue just means that the government is able to like somehow use the revenue raised to buy like a really valuable public good or make a lump sum transfer or something like that. And so it's going to be very flexible, even if though this revenue weight is black boxed, but it's going to sort of flexibly imagine that we have some outside potential redistributive allocation opportunity or redistributive opportunity that's just not through this market. And we're studying like, what's the shadow trade-off between that market, that outside opportunity and the extent to which we redistribute inside this market. Questions about where we're going?
The word universally desirable, or should I wait?
I'll define it formally. It's going to mean that even the lowest types of agents in a given group find the good valuable. And so the special case you want to keep in mind, this is going to be a superset of, the essential goods. And basically the prediction here is that you're going to want in-kind redistribution for anything that's universally desirable in the cases where you're doing certain types of redistribution. And, so it's going to look like, you want healthcare or like food or like there's like essential goods redistribution at the sort of bottom of the distribution. Cool. Apologies for doing the massive, literature slide with 1,000 references, but I know this is being recorded. So if people want, they can sort of pull all of these different subcategories. Let me just very quickly like point to this top bit. In addition to the redistribution through markets paper I mentioned, I should sort of first note that every idea in economic theory, I have discovered that here's a theorem. Every idea in economic theory is an echo of an idea from the golden age of economic theory, and this research program is no different. Marty Weitzman has this beautiful paper that asks the very simple question, which is like, when you're concerned about redistribution, might you not want to use a market mechanism and prefer to use rationing instead? And the answer, he concluded was yes, definitely. In some sense, you can think of our prior paper and this one as taking the Weitzman idea and showing not just that, like, so the comparative static is true, right? Like Weitzman showed you might in fact want rationing instead of the market clearing mechanisms, but actually that like the optimal mechanism might indeed involve some amount of rationing. And then methodologically in this paper, we're leaning quite a lot on some tools by Condorelli. All right, so formal model, we are allocating a unit mass of objects to a unit mass of agents. Each object is going to have a quality Q. And agent types, as I've already hinted, have this unobserved social welfare weight term, but they also have an observable label and an unobserved willingness to pay. So your label is like your group. This could be, your socioeconomic status in some binning. It could be the neighborhood you live in. It could be your profession. This is sort of anything that is observable to the market designer and verifiable, of course, right? Like as usual, we assume observable things are truthfully verifiable without having to elicit them. These are observable things on which one might be able to condition the allocation.
Quick question, Scott, is the label endogenous or exogenous?
It's part of the agent type. So all of these are fixed for each agent.
Exogenous, okay.
Yep.
So you're like, if living in a certain neighborhood would give me some benefit because statistically speaking,
right,
I would be considered poorer, you're not allowing me to move from the middle class to the low class neighborhood. Okay.
Totally right. We are not allowing endogenous resorting. And indeed, in the rideshare example I gave before, one thing one oversimplification I made that is emphatically not without loss of generality is I sort of assumed that the entire set of rideshare drivers is known. Right? Like if you're going to effect a transfer to all the rideshare drivers, this market has free entry, like, sort of if we started giving out massive transfers, maybe new people would enter. And that would like dilute our ability to make the transfer. We're turning all of that off. I guess, and indeed, right? Like we're sort of, there's a little bit, we're eliciting things about, your type in a way that's incentive compatible, where we're not solving this higher order, like incentive question of like, how would you choose your label if you could? It's a great question. And assuredly it affects these types of policies, right? If we do redistribution, to a specific group, then, people, if they can, would maybe want to join that group, which, dilutes the redistributive value. One related issue that we actually do account for, though, is, in our prior paper, we talk on the buyer side about this possibility that comes up a lot in public housing, right? So places like Amsterdam that have really nice, sort of public housing often have the problem that the people who end up acquiring that housing are actually like less in need than some others, right? Because, maybe it's means tested, at one point, but not when you then claim the unit. And so you might go on the list when you're in college and you have a net negative income. And then, 10 years later, when you finally make it to the front of the allocation rule or the allocation list, now suddenly you actually have quite a significant income. But you might still qualify to live in public housing. And the funny thing about price ceilings is that they favor the buy side. On the buy side, they favor the buyers with more ability to pay on the margin, right? The opposite of sellers, right? If the price, as you get poorer on the margin, you're more willing to sell. As you get poorer, you're less willing to buy. And so on the buy side, imposing a price ceiling, like a simple price ceiling, actually is never going to be the optimal mechanism in this type of context. Because it doesn't sort, right? It doesn't it doesn't identify through people's behavior, like the people who are most in need. It actually sort of still identifies the ones who need it less. And so we show in redistribution through markets is that, the optimal buy side rationing mechanism is to have a high price at which everyone, almost everyone transacts, and then a lower price, for a lower quality or lower probability or something like, sort of like a lower type good that, costs much less. And this gap has to be big enough that the people who are buying the high quality good or the good with certainty don't want to jump into the other category. So that's a type of mimicry that we're accounting for. But again, it's only for sort of the types being fixed ex ante. We're not accounting for things where people might like change their profession to, take advantage of a redistributive scheme. Great question again. Okay, cool. So we've got an observable label, an unobserved willingness to pay, and an unobserved social welfare weight. The designer is going to know the type distribution, and of course, see everybody's label. And then, and this goes to the question Steve asked earlier about sort of like the welfare weight structure. So if an agent of type IR lambda receives a good with quality Q and pays T, then she's going to get utility QR minus T, but her contribution to social welfare is going to be weighted by that lambda. And so the social planner, like the objective function depends on this lambda, but of course the social planner can't quite see it. And so they're going to have to be drawing inferences about lambda from I and the R that they elicit. And note, of course, you might think that you could like that the right strategy is just to ask people to tell us, to announce their welfare weight. But because the agent's utility doesn't depend on the welfare weight, you can't elicit the welfare weight, right? Like, they'll just tell, if we know that people with in some, with some weight get a better allocation, they'll just all declare that allocation. And so we have to do this via inference. We can't just elicit it directly. Okay, so standard mechanism design framework. The designer has access to arbitrary direct allocation mechanisms subject to feasibility, incentive compatibility, individual rationality, and sort of no subsidy constraints. And the designer is going to maximize this alpha weighted sum of revenue and utility. So there's a weight alpha on the sort of net transfer, and lambda, sort of on all of these utilities.
Scott, I mean, yes. I know you're running short on time, so we can leave this to the discussion, but just a question of interpretation. So in the previous paper that you described only briefly, you viewed this as sort of different values for money.
Yes.
Here you describe it as welfare weights, and mathematically you can go back and forth between those two things, but totally. Interpretationally they mean slightly different things, I guess.
Completely. Yeah, and
so
indeed.
Why choose one or the other? And do you have thoughts, or do you want to wait till?
No. I'm happy to comment on this right now. So we'd originally actually written the first paper with both of these parametrizations. And
evil referee is forced you to pick. No.
What do you say?
An evil referee is forced you to pick. No.
No, I think the experience of like explaining it to people and like working through it in conversation like led us to realize that it was important to pick. The math, sort of the math passes through that isometry, right? We do show in that paper that these two ways of thinking about the problem are equivalent. And in that paper, like we really were thinking about it as a model of a marketplace with two sides, buyers and sellers, and it lived in this story that I told at the beginning, where like they had heterogeneous need as measured by their value for money, and so in that context, we decided to like you keep that parametrization for that paper, right? That was sort of the concept of like if you're in a two-sided market and you're trying to decide how much do you want to distort the allocative efficiency in order to improve equity. We were thinking of it in this language and frame of equity as defined by people's need inside this market. This paper has a different purpose, which is to provide a framework for thinking about when you want, sort of this in-kind redistribution or not. And for that, we actually found it was much more useful to think about like, to think about the lambdas as abstract objects that and think about their correlation or relation to these other terms. And so working in this parameterization is actually sort of, I think, easier from the vantage point, if you will, of the policymaker to understand like whether you should be doing in-kind redistribution or not. So I think it's an ex post feature that we have sort of the stories told in both parametrizations so that you can like go and learn it in either one. But I agree with you, having them both in the same talk is a little bit confusing.
No, not confusing. I just wanted to know the reasons.
Fair enough. As with all things where you get to pick the parametrization, you pick the one that's like sort of most intuitive for interpreting what you're saying. I guess is the simultaneously like correct and slightly cop-out answer. Awesome. Any further questions about the setup? Cool. All right. So as I've already hinted, the key sort of for these allocation problems, the designer is going to be forming expectations over the welfare weights. Sort of looking at the expectation of lambda given I and R as elicited. Remember, we're insisting on incentive compatibility rather, so that the R is reported truthfully. And what does this really mean? Well, we've already been talking about it sort of colloquially. It's that the designer is effectively estimating agents' need given what they can observe and what they can elicit. So, you might know that somebody is sort of high welfare weight because they're in a neighborhood that is, underprivileged or something like that. You also might know that somebody is high welfare weight because you see them engaging in a transaction or lack of transaction that suggests that they might be high need, right? So if somebody turns down a life-saving medical treatment, your inference is presumably not that they didn't want the life-saving medical treatment, but that they didn't have the ability to pay for it. And so, a rate of substitution, might sometimes be, the observed willingness to pay might sometimes indicate essentially that they are, the low willingness to pay might be an indication of high need in some markets. All of this is going to make clear that the optimal allocation is basically going to depend on the, sort of statistical relationship between the labels and the willingness to pay and these unobserved welfare weights. So very quickly, just under the hood, what's going on, the optimal mechanism is actually found in 2 steps, and they're very intuitive. So within groups, there's going to be sort of an optimal within group allocation. That's, the answer is sort of determined by mechanism design. And I'll talk to you in a moment about what that looks like, what the within group allocation looks like. And then across, that's going to imply, sort of what the within group allocation is going to imply sort of a marginal social welfare value, which is marginal expected social welfare value, rather, of allocating each quality unit to a different group. And so that's going to give us, the allocation across groups. And actually all you need is a greedy algorithm. You're basically going to, allocate quality units across the groups, to maximize the marginal expected social return of the marginal quality unit. But so now the real question, and this is, as I said, it's a framework. We're sort of, uncovering when you want to use in-kind versus market, in-kind redistribution versus market allocation. First of all, just quickly, what is in-kind redistribution in this framework? What it means is you're going to do, instead of pricing, doing allocation of quality units by, on a price curve, you're going to pick, some, sort of set of units and allocate them, at a below market price. So there's randomly. So it's a form of rationing, but it's rationing in quality space. Random allocation of a range of quality levels at a below market price. When do you want to do this? Well, with the setup I described, it's actually at this point, it should hopefully feel almost tautological, right? You want to, use in-kind redistribution when you're uncovering inequality in the unobserved welfare weights. 2 ways that can happen. One is when the label alone reveals that, right? When you know that the, sort of average Pareto weight on a given group exceeds the weight on revenue, then you want at least some in-kind redistribution in that market, or in that group, so long as the good is universally desirable. And I'll give a more formal statement of this in a moment. But this is going to imply, food stamps, public housing, sort of settings where you know that some people are high welfare weight or high need. In this case, sort of as indicated by low income or lack of stable employment or something of the sort. Here's where you're going to just know from some observable information that you might want to redistribute to them. The second category, this is this healthcare example I gave before, is when the willingness to pay within a group reveals something about inequality. So within some group, the welfare weights might be strongly negatively correlated with willingness to pay. This is, again, like the life-saving medical treatment. If you're turning it down, we're probably learning that you're actually somebody who's high need. And this could imply, sort of some form of in-kind redistribution for products like healthcare. The underlying mechanics of these 2 results are actually pretty different, right? So, when the average Pareto weight on a group exceeds the weight on revenue, you want to use some in-kind redistribution for universally desirable goods. Formally, what this means, just let me restate that with notation. If the average Pareto weight, lambda I is strictly larger than the weight on revenue alpha. So this means, it's, you want to redistribute to the group I more on average than just, sort of whatever's covered by your desire for revenue. And the good is universally desirable. This is the lowest type in group I actually wants the good. Then, there's some cutoff so that all the types below that cutoff get the good, sort of in random allocation. the wrong intuition. So that what it sounds like this is saying is that you want to increase the welfare of the agents with the lowest willingness to pay by giving them the good for free. But remember, what's actually happening here, like this is at the level of the group, right? This is label revealed inequality. We actually want to redistribute to everybody in the group, but the only way to do that actually is to lower the price. And if we do random allocation at the bottom for free, we can lower the price for everyone because the sort of the cutoff type between the unpriced and priced allocation is lower, or is at a lower price rather, because it's, you know, it's effectively the price of the average good in the random pool rather than the marginal good at the end of the pool. And so, you know, when you want to redistribute to an entire group, we find this in-kind redistribution, but for a mechanism designing reason, which is that it lets us lower price. Meanwhile, there's this other case, which is willingness to pay revealed inequality. Here's when the welfare weights are strongly and negatively correlated with willingness to pay. Again, written in notation, you want fully assortative matching. So that's, you know, market allocation, if and only if this sort of combination of like a revenue term, which is the weight on revenue times something that looks like a virtual value, plus this welfare weight term is non-decreasing. And so what we learn is that like market allocation is going to be suboptimal when willingness to pay is strongly negatively correlated with the welfare rate weights, right? When you sort of are getting a lot in this like virtual value term, but that means that you're sort of in the wrong part of your, that giving the good to an agent would be sort of wrong from a social welfare perspective under your welfare rule. So that takes us very nicely to sort of the converse question, or the dual question, I guess, which is when do you want to use market mechanisms? That is, when do you want to have assortative matching based on quality levels at market clearing prices for each quality? And here, again, so this really should sound totally tautological, but again, there's actually some subtlety to it. So roughly, you want to use market mechanisms when revenue or efficiency motives dominate versus redistributive concerns. Okay, fair enough. We use market mechanisms when we care about revenue and efficiency. Thank you for joining us for those 48 minutes to get to that conclusion. But what does that actually mean? Like, when does revenue matter? Well, precisely, it's when the weight on revenue is above the average Pareto weight. By the way, sort of towards this question of like, why this parameterization, it's this trade-off that makes the most sense in this parameterization, right? That being able to speak on the relationship between alpha and the lambda terms is actually like, what's driving the difference between, market versus in-kind redistribution. So when the weight on revenue is above the average Pareto weight, you want to be running some amount of assortative matching. There are two ways in which that could happen, right? In the private market context, right? This could just be like, the company cares on, about raising money, or equivalently, even in a public market context, it could be that, we don't place, particularly high welfare weight on the buyers, right? They could be corporations, buying oil leases or spectrum licenses or something of the sort. But also it could be when this alpha represents a lump sum transfer, right? So like when raising revenue allows us to give something to the target population, this framework still allows for that to be a more efficient way of making the transfer than redistributing through the market itself. Question, go for it.
So I have, I guess, what if even if the weight on revenue was 0, but you do have incomplete information, you have asymmetric information, and you have differentiation of the goods. So some assortative matching would still be optimal just to maximize utilities for the right, if alpha was 0, right?
Totally. Yes. So again, depending on the other parameters, the extent that to which you want to do that, but yes, right? So like here, even in this context where you're redistributing the universally desirable good, the allocations could be random at, for the low types, but you might still have assortative matching at the top of the distribution. In general, you will. Like the optimal mechanism is usually a hybrid. And indeed, even more in this efficiency maximization context. So when the welfare weights are not strongly correlated with willingness to pay, then for sure you're going to want assortative matching because efficiency is all you can get. Right. And so that could happen through, sort of two different sort of mechanics. One of them is that there's small dispersion in the welfare weights to begin with. Right. And the other is that there might be large dispersion in the welfare weights, but little correlation with willingness to pay. right? And so, for example, if you're allocating to a group where there's small dispersion in the welfare weights, like, of course you want to sort of matching, because that's just like, sort of the utility, the efficient utility maximizing strategy. You also might want to do this if you just can't learn very much about the welfare weights from people's rates of substitution. So think about like milk or something, right? Like, one's decision of whether to buy milk or not doesn't reveal much about their level of need. It's much more likely to just be sort of like a statement about their taste for milk or not, or against. I went through that sort of quickly. Let me pause for questions again. Is that sufficiently clear? Cool. All right.
Max has a question, actually.
Oh, please go for it. Sorry, I didn't see the.
Allow him to talk.
Hi.
Hey.
So, can you see my video?
Let's see.
That's
Not
fine.
yet, but that's fine. We can hear you.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, we can't hear you though.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. All right, all good. So I was wondering, I understand that the standard answer to, sorry, the whole Zoom is acting up. I apologize about this. Okay. I understand that the standard answer to market inequality has, traditionally been to just let the market clear and to redistribute ex post. And I'm wondering if that is possible, why would it be better to use a market mechanism like rationing? Isn't, delivering a surplus at the cost of a deadweight loss a pretty expensive price? Or should it be different between, an in-market mechanism and an ex post redistribution?
Great. So a couple of different pieces. It's a great question, right? So, and a couple of different pieces to the answer to that question. First of all, as I said, we're not arguing that this is a superior mechanism relative to, sort of classical public finance. Certainly not in general. And nowhere have we modeled sort of like a classical public finance system adjoint to a market-based redistribution system. We do have this sort of reduced form alpha, which is sort of the public finance component, right? And one of the predictions is going to be that when we have like a really efficient redistribution system outside, that's like we think of alpha as being super high, which then means that indeed, like you're going to get to this revenue maximization case where you actually want to let the market clear. And so, in some reduced form way, we're already predicting that if you have like a really, really efficient outside public finance system, you're not going to want to do redistribution at the individual market level necessarily. But footnote, remember this example of like people showing up to drive rideshare at the beginning of the pandemic. It is going to be the case that this market-based redistribution, because we learn stuff about people's welfare weight from their behavior, might be able to sometimes do more than you can just with classical public finance, right? Like I sort of think of classical public finance as being based around the labels, the I's, and that there might be other information that goes into somebody's lambda, like do you have a sick relative, or do you like sort of do you have some other like idiosyncratic short run need that's not well modeled on like a thing that might be on a tax form. So there might still be information encoded in those R's that we think is relevant for welfare that just simply isn't being accounted for in classical public finance. And that's why this sort of like trade-off between alpha and the average Pareto weight is what matters, right? We might think that the average Pareto weight like contains a lot of information that's still not like captured in the outside systems. So I totally agree with you, right? Like most contexts, you're going to want like, market-based allocation here, right? I'm giving you a Chicago control for price, sort of Chicago case for price controls, but I'm not advocating that it should be used in all markets all the time. Indeed, I'm showing that the conditions under which you want to use them are actually like pretty narrow, but they're very intuitive, and they all link to this relation between, the observable information and the elicitable information and those unobserved welfare weights that drive the welfare function. All right, so we've got about 5 minutes left. Let me just quickly, quickly speak to, sort of state a proposition that speaks very precisely to the question about the revenue maximizing motive at the high type. Essentially, what we're going to get is, sort of a price gradient at the top in order to raise revenue, even for random allocation at the bottom, which is essentially equivalent, Mallesh, to your comment that like, don't you care about utility maximization at the top? It's the same thing, right? And then just one very counterintuitive fact is that if you have two groups, one group where there's assortative matching and another group there's fully random matching, you actually want to, allocate, the question is which quality units go where. The random matching group actually, in the optimal mechanism, gets quality units of middling quality. And why is that? That sounds sort of odd, right? We normally think that when we're doing, sort of in-kind redistribution, we're giving away like lower quality goods. Here, it's because the dispersion of quality levels is actually important for revenue maximization. So this, again, we learned something from the mechanism design that I at least would not have been able to pick out initially, which is that to the extent that we care about raising revenue in the, sort of the group that's getting matched assortatively, we can actually do a better job at that if we have like a broader quality gradient. Okay. So we have like 3 minutes left. Let me just quickly note that sort of thinking about welfare weights in this way, and it sort of like changed a lot of how I think about allocation problems. And like one simple intuitive example, just for people to take home with them. Early on in the pandemic, again, another thing that happened was a lot of people bought hand sanitizer, mostly from dollar stores and other sort of like, low-income neighborhood distribution centers, or distribution sources rather, and then resold them on Amazon for, many multiples of the original price, right? Like there was a period where like, a bottle of hand sanitizer might've been $40 or $80. And there were a lot of complaints around price gouging. But then a lot of other people said, but wait a minute, like, hang on, I don't understand. Like, hand sanitizers in demand, like, price should go up. The argument, sort of the takeaway from thinking in the language of these papers is, well, this was a really regressive transfer, right? Sort of you took hand sanitizer from low income areas, you put them on the internet and sold them at very, to people who had access to internet, purchasing opportunities at very high prices. This is a way of transferring hand sanitizer from people with low ability to pay to people with high ability to pay. And how do we know that? Well, it's like inelastic demand. At the start of the pandemic, everybody needed hand sanitizer. We didn't have any sense of like, how necessary it was, but everyone needed it, right? Because there was a chance it was extremely necessary. But if anything, from a social welfare perspective, you wanted people in lower income communities to have more of it. They live in larger groups. They were less able to work from home, had to have more, had more like in-person, like frontline jobs. But this transfer was sort of exactly the reverse. It was taking hand sanitizer away from people, in low-income communities and selling it to people with high willingness to pay, but where willingness to pay was really just an indicator of ability to pay. And so to the extent that we're responding to this as, and sort of saying like, this is inefficient reallocation, that again speaks to like a welfare weight story, right? That, the market allocation was inefficient because willingness to pay was inversely correlated with the, with the level of need, or rather with the level of need as interpreted through the welfare weights. So that's our story for today. Model of optimal allocation under general redistributive concerns. We've uncovered this sort of framework for thinking about when you might want to, use redistributive allocation mechanisms. As I say, this is an agenda, and there's we're very new to it, and there's so much we're still thinking about, and we'd love to have you think about it and talk with us and tell us your thoughts. Simple things like these models are very linear, and which means they're turning off things like income effects and risk aversion. They're also very ex ante, and a lot of times we care about ex post fairness and resolutions. Even if it's like we're talking about investment, like you're maybe going to buy a car to become a rideshare driver. Well, now if we do something that causes your allocation to get super stochastic because there's rationing day to day, that might not be so good actually. We're also now in some work with Shengwu Li, thinking about other screening mechanisms such as queuing. And as I mentioned in this paper with Eric Budish, we talked about vaccine allocation and prioritization. And then, towards Max's question, right, there's this big question of how we should think about interaction with conventional redistributive tools as well. But in any event, all of that for some other day. In the meantime, let me just sort of say QED, and thanks again.
Any questions for the general discussion before we stop live streaming? Okay, if not, Colin, I guess we can shut off the live streaming. And if any